Shalom, everyone. Good morning. A pleasure to be with you today here, and especially a pleasure and a privilege to follow Dr. Blazing. And I think one of the areas that the church at large, and Christian theology in particular, is not really well equipped to deal with the reality that's taking place, and that is to me, and I'm sure to you as well, the fact that is a wonderful fact that more and more Jewish people are turning to the Messiah, Yeshua. And so my part in this is to, in the conference and at this particular session, is to share with you a bit of new research regarding what is God doing in modern Israel. If we have time at the end, I'll tell you a story and show you a fun picture, but really what I want to do is kind of describe to you in the next 50 minutes or so. And I say or so because I'm from the Middle East, time for us is relative and so on. So, no, but I'll try to be good and keep it in the bounds here and even leave some time for questions. So I want to start by describing, first of all, what's took place in Jewish evangelism before the birth of the state of Israel. So I want to just want to look at what took place before 1947 and 1948. And actually, before I do that, I want to mention that this presentation is the essence of a chapter that will come out in a book by Dr. Glazer from Chosen People Ministries, who's going to have a session in the afternoon, as well as Dr. Darrell Bach from Dallas Theological Seminary for Israel's 70th birthday. So 1947, it was in 29th of November, the League of Nations, later to become the United Nations, have declared the partition of the land of Israel and basically a homeland for the Jewish people. About 6 months later, the state of Israel has self-declared its independence on the 14th of May, 1948. But actually, before that time, I want to just briefly touch on that, what happened with Messianic Jews, Jewish followers of the Messiah, in the land. So really, to go back, this year, we are commemorating, in a lot of places, 500 years to the Reformation. I'm not going to talk about that. I will just say that following the Reformation, and due to the fact that a lot of people started reading their Bibles, there has been an awakening in eschatological interest. We see that particularly in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And so an interest in Israel, an interest in sharing the gospel with Jewish people, and a general eschatological interest. So a very important event that took place relating to Israel, to the land of Israel, took place in 1841. 1841, England and Prussia, Germany, have decided, the churches, the Anglican and Lutheran churches, have decided jointly that it is time to have a Protestant bishop in Jerusalem. And they have chosen none other but a Jewish believer by the name Michael Solomon Alexander, who was the former rabbi of Norwich and Plymouth in England, has become a follower of the Messiah, was later a Hebrew professor at London University. And he was named as the first Anglican bishop in Jerusalem. So that was a very, very symbolic occurrence. And it certainly drew attention. Not only mainline Protestant churches have a presence in Jerusalem, but no other, it's a Jewish believer in the Messiah. So in a lot of people's minds, this made an immediate connection to the ancient church that we read about in the book of Acts that is essentially Jewish. So this theme of restoring the ancient church of the book of Acts is the scarlet cord, as it were, of Messianic Jews in the land of Israel. And we'll see that more and more. So in 1917, following World War I, the British mandate in Israel began. And under the British, the few, it wasn't many, but several hundred Messianic Jews in the land of Israel, were free to operate. Of course, at that time, the general Jewish population was trying to immigrate, or some were trying to immigrate to Israel, and Jewish believers in Christ were not popular among Jewish people, but they enjoyed the kind of being under the auspices of the British. A very important event that in a lot of ways is etched in the memory of Messianic Jews in Israel is called Operation Grace. So following the United Nations declaration of the partition of the land, homeland for the Jews and for the Arabs, several things took place. So the British were preparing to leave the country. The Arabs, surrounding Arab nations, are declaring war and intend to annihilate the Jews, or in their language, push the Jews back to the sea and clean the land and take all of it. So the British are getting ready to leave, and then the church clerics, the Anglican church clerics say, well, we got Jewish believers in Jesus here in this country, several hundred. What are we going to do with them? And so the British come up with what's called historically Operation Grace. Operation Grace offered asylum under the Anglican Church to the Messianic Jews in Israel at the time. And the fact is that the majority, and historically it's estimated from several dozens to several hundred Messianic Jews, the great majority of the Messianic Jews in Israel left. The logic was that, well, in the likely event that the Arabs are going to win this ensuing war, they're not going to make a difference between, a Messianic Jew and a non-Messianic Jew. I mean, they're going to kill everybody. And in the unlikely event that the Jewish people will win, well, the Messianic Jews are not popular anyway, and they're not going to have it so good in the new state of Israel. So most Messianic Jews left. Now, this was, like I said, a very traumatic event for the Messianic Jews in Israel. At that time, very, very few, literally 3 to 4 families, some counted in 23 Messianic Jews remained in Israel when, after the 15th of May or the 14th of May, 1948. So that was the situation. My father-in-law, my wife's father, he grew up as a child. He was born in the 40s, and he grew up as a child. He's one of those families that remain in the land. And he's saying how in the first decades of the state of Israel, as Jewish followers of Yeshua, they were, as kids and then as young adults, they were discriminated in school, called names, and so on. Particularly after Operation Grace, the Jewish population looked at the Messianic Jews and said, here he goes again. Like you guys did at the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 132, 135 AD, when the Jewish people rebel against the Romans, but the Messianic Jews refused to participate under the flag of a false Messiah. So again, this is, for time's sake, I'm not going to go into this, but this, for those that remember this event, this has risen a lot of emotions in the Jewish community. And indeed, the Messianic Jews that remained were also very critical towards the one that have left. But the state of Israel was established in 1948. A few Messianic Jews are there. There are several missionaries and mission agencies that were present before 1948 and therefore allowed to remain in the country, but very, very little activity in those years, particularly among Messianic Jews. There were some attempts, again, for time reasons, I'm not going to go into it, but in the 50s, in the 60s, those few Messianic Jews were trying to define who they are in the Jewish state. Not an easy situation. An important event took place in 1967. 1967, the Six-Day War. Is this thing working, by the way? Yes. It is. Where are we now? It is now. There we go. There we go. 1967. He didn't miss much. It's just the years there. So, 1967, the Six-Day War. Against all odds, the young state of Israel, in 6 days, smashes the Arab armies, the Egyptian army, and the armies around Israel. A great victory. Jerusalem is reunited, and for the first time in 2,000 years, there's Jewish sovereignty over the Temple Mount and the holy places in the city of Jerusalem. So, of course, this kind of drew the attention of a lot of evangelical believers around the world, and this kind of paralleled, the years after, paralleled the Jesus movement in the United States, where a lot of people have come to the Lord, among them many Jewish people. And some of those Jewish people that have become followers of Yeshua immigrated to Israel in the 70s and the 80s, and that gave an initial boost to the young and very small Messianic community in Israel. There's not a lot of research from those years that actually describes Messianic Jews in the country, partially because there were so few. There is a study, and I want to relate to that, mention it, that was done in 1989. It was actually done by a graduate of this institution. I'm sure some of you know him, Dr. Jim Sibley. And so Jim and his wife Kathy were serving in Israel in the 80s, and in 89, Dr. Sibley wrote a description from his vantage point on the Messianic movement in Israel. So the main findings of the 1989 study are the following. First of all, there is some sort of a non-formal organization of Messianic leaders and pastors in the country. And most of the pastors come together in this unofficial conference and, cooperate with one another. Very positive. The other thing is, in terms of numbers, Dr. Sibley counts, and he knows personally, in the article he mentions this, about approximately 30 Messianic congregations in the entire country. And, at that part, and again, in this study, you can find it if you want. In the chapter is going to be, of course, a reference to it. Dr. Sibley is talking about a process of indigenization. They become more indigenized, more local people are starting to get into the congregations. It particularly stands out because the language is switching in many of the congregations, or in process of switching from English, that's the language that most of the missionaries spoke, to Hebrew. That's the language that most of the local people spoke at the time. So, and also he mentions a switch from translated hymns, church hymns, to original songs written in Hebrew. The community is largely, in those years, in the 80s, is small, is trying to define itself legally, is trying to find its place in the Israeli society, but, it's likened to a very young adolescent, trying to understand how he fits in and where you belong and so on. And there is quite a bit of social unacceptance. Socially speaking, being a Jewish follower of Yeshua in those years in Israel is not accepted at all. And I've personally have become a follower of Yeshua a few years after the study was published, a couple of years after it was published, and I've experienced those kind of things firsthand. When we would talk to someone about Yeshua, the response was, well, who's ever heard of a Jewish person, crossing this uncrossable line and becoming a follower of Yeshua? So that's in 89. In 1999, there we go. There's another research. It's done by two Danish Protestant people, and their findings show a pretty significant advancement, actually, in the Messianic movement. They count and personally interview 81 Messianic leaders in the land of Israel. So they say there's 81 believers, Messianic congregations in the country. However, only less than 20% of them are led by local people. So 80% are led by people that were born outside the borders of Israel. The overall theme in that study and in that period is, in their language, a tendency of the congregations to become more Jewish. And when they say that, they mean, again, trying to create some sort of an expression of faith in Yeshua that is more Israeli, more Jewish, that kind of is in the context of the land of Israel. They mention, like Sibley did 10 years prior, that a very common experience of Messianic congregations is getting harassed, persecuted by so-called anti-missionary organizations. And they exist with us to this day. These are ultra-Orthodox Jewish people like Paul in his day before he met the Messiah that believe that they serve God by making the life of the Jewish believers as difficult as possible. So that was very much present in the 90s as well. Now, really, since 89 and now we're talking about 99, several things happened that are very important, several processes in the Israeli society and the Messianic community and the Christian community at large, evangelical community at large, took place that are important. First of all, the Israeli government, and this is important for me to say, the state of Israel is a democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. And that's in our we don't have it in Constitution, but in our Declaration of Independence. There's going to be freedom of religion, equality for all. And it's true, that's how it is in the state of Israel. So sharing one's faith, whatever it may be, with an adult is completely legal. And you can talk about your faith all you want, so long you don't give stuff to people to believe, basically buying them out to believe in what you want. Now, parallel to this freedom that we, as the followers of the Messiah in Israel, exercise, the Israeli government started making the life of particularly of well-meaning evangelical missionaries sent to Israel harder and harder. It became harder to stay in the land of Israel. And in fact, in the last 25 years, many of those missionaries had to leave the country. So that's one process that took place. Another process that was very, very important and impacted the country, impacted the community of believers very significantly is a massive immigration of Jewish people from the former Soviet Union. And that has changed the country, it has changed the local body of believers as well. And the 1999 study mentioned this. So in terms of size, from 30 in 89, now we are at 81 congregations, maybe 5,000 Jewish followers of the Messiah, Messianic Jews in the whole country of Israel, largely marginalized, trying to, again, there's some form of unity in the community. People get to know each other, particularly the leaders, and there are attempts to define the Messianic community in the land. Now, since 1999, it's almost 20 years, there's not been an actual study actual research trying to look at the Messianic community in Israel. And we have done, a couple of colleagues and myself from One for Israel have done that kind of research, and I want to share some of the findings with you today. So I want to describe how we did it. First of all, very briefly. Here, let me go to 2017 study. So we have compiled a questionnaire and sent it to all the leaders, rabbis, Messianic pastors in the land of Israel, personally, with a note, asking them to reply to the questions, to the survey. 2 weeks after we did that, we also started sending it through various, and it's a web-based questionnaire. We sent it to various forums of Israeli Messianic Jews in the land. It was in 3 languages. It was only sent inside Israel, only to Messianic Jews, although, and that's important for me to say, I'm not speaking about this today, but the body of the Messiah in Israel is made up of both Jewish and Arab followers of the Messiah. And we at One for Israel and at our Bible college and seminary are privileged to serve the entire body. But what I'm talking about today relates only to the Messianic Jewish community. So the total sample size of people that have replied to our questionnaire was 298 adult Messianic Jews. Let me see here. I think I have some graphics for you in a second. There we go. It's going one by one. Very nice. So we sent the questionnaire in 3 languages. We sent it in Hebrew, in English, and in Russian. We just wanted to, it's identical, and we wanted the people that fill it just to feel very, very comfortable. So 241 people filled the questionnaire in Hebrew, 39 filled it in English, and 18 filled it in Russian language. The 298 sample is comprised of 76 leaders. These are Messianic pastors, rabbis, elders, etc., and 222 lay people. The age range was from 18, because we're talking about adults here, to 73. The median age, and a median is if you put all the ages one by one, you put your finger on the one in the middle. It's a little bit different than the average. It's a better count. The point is the median was age 31. So just to give us an understanding of the sample, it was skewed to the younger side. In terms of gender, we had 47 women and 53% men. Now, I do want to mention here that as compares to the general Israeli population, in the general Israeli population, 49.5% are men, and 50.5% are women. So our sample was slightly skewed, but still, as a sample, it's actually quite good. In terms of marital status, 56% of respondents were married and 42% were single. There are a small number of divorced people, a small number of widowed. And here's an interesting statistic. 63% of our respondents in the sample were born in Israel, what's called in Israel Sabra. And 37% were born outside of Israel. In other words, they immigrated to Israel at some age, I mean, some as children. This is, again, a little bit skewed than the general population. In the general Israeli population, 75% of the Israeli population were born in Israel, and 25% were born outside the land of Israel. So this is slightly skewed, but it is typical to the, I believe, to the body of the Messiah in Israel. In terms of educational level, oh, I keep forget to click it. There we go. There you got it. So educational level, about 60% of the respondents had up to high school education. Most of them had a high school diploma, about 44%. And 40% of people had an academic education. Of the 40, 19% had a graduate degree. So again, the sample is fairly representative of the Israeli general population. And let's go to, now I have an interesting, what I think is quite an interesting chart for you. And this talks about the growth of the Messianic body in Israel. And this is why I'm saying that I think largely the church at large is not ready to deal with that. It doesn't have the theological tools, and this is why I think Dr. Blazing's lecture was so important. So note this. In 1948, there are 600,000 Jewish people residing in the state of Israel, out of about 10 million that survived the Holocaust worldwide. So the diaspora are 5 million in the US, about 5 million in Russia and the former Soviet Union, of course some in other places, but 600,000 Jewish people in Israel. Messianic congregations as such, when the state is established, there are none. There's only churches that are led by denominations and missionaries, and the total number of Messianic Jews in 1948, as I mentioned, is 23. A pretty big jump of almost 50 years to, almost 40, a little over 40 years to 1989. The state of Israel, there are 3.5 million Jewish people. Number of Messianic congregations is estimated in 30, and the number of Messianic Jews in Israel, there's no conclusive data. I would say it is somewhere in the vicinity of 1,200. So this is the jump in 40 years, not a bad jump. 1999, about 4.8 million Jewish people residing in the state of Israel, and approximately 81 congregations in the entire country. That study estimated the number of Jewish believers in the Messiah in Israel in 5,000. Almost 20 years later, our study from this year, we have found 300 congregations and home groups. These are Messianic Jewish congregations and home groups in the land of Israel. And a conservative estimate, I mean, our data shows that there could be actually a lot more, but a conservative estimate is 300,000, 30,000 Messianic Jews in the land of Israel. Now, 30,000, in absolute numbers, you have in the Dallas-Fort Worth area churches that, you'd have that number in a weekend, in services. But the point is not just the absolute number. The point is the growth. And the growth is not linear, it's exponential. And I mentioned, 25 years ago when I've become a follower of Yeshua and talked to someone on the street about him, I would get the response, how come as a Jew you talk to us about Jesus? Who's ever heard about this kind of thing? When we do the same thing today, it doesn't mean that everybody agree with us, but close to everyone that we talk to has already heard of this phenomenon of a growing group of Jewish people claiming Yeshua as our Messiah. So the growth is truly quite amazing. And there we go. The size of the community, as I mentioned, is 300 congregations, about 30,000 Messianic Jews. And here's an interesting data. 60% of our sample, representative sample, are first-generation believers. This is interesting. That means that, by the way, the next largest group is second-generation believers. In other words, their parents were first-generation. So that means that the body is very young, and the growth is mostly, people coming to know the Lord. The growth is not people having children. I mean, it's great when you have children and then you teach them to walk in the ways of the Lord, but that exponential growth is because more people are becoming followers of Yeshua. The leadership model in most of the congregations, 56% of the congregations have salaried pastors, 44% have non-salaried leadership. This is pretty typical, again, for developing kind of a young national body of the Messiah. The congregational character. Israel is a land of immigrants. As I mentioned, 25% of our citizens were not born in Israel. And each one of us residing in Israel, I was born in Israel, but I look back a couple of generations and my grandparents immigrated. So we're a country of immigrants. So the reason I say this is because being Israeli is something that it's a huge thing in our society, in a general society. And it's a even bigger thing in the Messianic community. And so we've asked, the people that participated, the sample, we asked them, how Israeli do you perceive your congregation to be? And, let me put it up there. And the answer was quite overwhelming. Most people use Hebrew. 92% of congregations use Hebrew as the main language. Now, the great majority of those congregations have translation, mainly to Russian, after that to English, but there's other languages. There was German, there was Spanish, a lot of languages, because we have a lot of immigrants from a lot of places. But Hebrew is the main language in 92% of the congregations. Between 90 and 100%, and the range is because we asked about all the main Jewish holidays, 90 to 100% celebrate the Jewish holidays. Of course, Passover being the 100%, but all those main Jewish holidays are celebrated in a congregational context in Israel. 93% said that they feel that their congregation is very Israeli, which again, identity, by and large, is made up of two things: what you perceive about yourself and what others perceive about you. So this one touches on what Israeli Messianic Jews perceive about ourselves. We definitely perceive ourselves as part and parcel of Israeli society, and that's a big thing. Kind of related to that, 99% of people said that their congregation actively encourages joining the IDF, the Israel Defensive Force. And, the IDF is kind of, being in the IDF or having served in the IDF is the hallmark of Israeli society. And that's very, very common, and so it's not surprised that this is encouraged in Messianic congregations. By the way, I will say that one of the what's the word I'm looking for here? One of the places in Israeli society that Israeli Messianic Jews receive the most acceptance and appreciation is the military. And, there are Messianic Jews that are serving as pilots, as officers, and very prestigious units in our intelligence units. So the Israeli Messianic Jewish community has a very good name in the IDF. That's no small thing. Now we get to something that's a little more tricky, maybe sticky, and that's how Israeli Messianic Jews perceive the relationship between them and the general Jewish people, between them and the church. Now, it's important to say, Messianic Jews everywhere, not just in Israel, all over the world, exist on the fringes or the edges of two worlds simultaneously. And I think Dr. Blazing's lecture kind of demonstrated that. It's on the fringes of the Jewish world and of that of the Christian world, or evangelical world. And each community tells the Messianic Jews, what's wrong with you guys? Jewish people say to Messianic Jews, well, you've crossed this line, and so why aren't you just calling yourselves Christian? That's it, because you believe in Yeshua and Jesus. That's the hallmark of being a Christian. And Messianic Jews say, well, Yeshua is Jewish. Sometimes I'm being told, that's pretty humorous to me at least, but it shows the depth of ignorance. I hear it not seldom, I hear it quite frequently. Yeshua was Jewish before he became a Christian. And I say, no, he is the Christ, he is the Messiah, he cannot become, anyhow. But, we get that. Now, and you probably heard, from the other side, from the church, a lot of Messianic Jews, mostly Messianic Jews would get the response, well, now that you guys believe in Yeshua, you guys are Christians, right? And you don't no longer Jews. You were a Jew before you converted to become a Christian, right? And so, no, I'm still Jewish. Actually, the most Jewish thing I've ever done is to become a follower of Yeshua. There's a great misunderstanding about it. And so there's an interesting term we use sometimes in our circles, and that's called Gentilizers. You probably heard the term Judaizers. Now, we use the term Gentilizers. It's kind of anyhow, we can move forward. So just in terms of how Israeli Messianic Jews perceive the relationship, 68% of Israeli Messianic Jews feel a full to significant congregational identification with the Jewish people. This is not personal, this is congregational. This is even more significant. So it's something that stands out in the congregation, close to 70%. The rest feel partial or somewhat. 63% of Israeli Messianic Jews significantly or fully or significantly identify with the evangelical church worldwide. Now, it's important to say that, oh yes, I have to click the thing. I have to tell you something. I teach in a seminary setting in Israel. I stopped doing those things that they come up a long time ago. I'm getting old. I don't have the patience so the people that helped me prepare this did this, which is a good thing. Again, a good thing. It's a good thing. So Israeli Messianic Jews make a very significant distinction between the evangelical church and the traditional churches. Because, one of the first things that we are told when we say to our people, our families, our friends, our neighbors that we are followers of Yeshua is, well, how can you do that? The Inquisition, the pogroms, the Crusades, how can you join those, people that did this to us? And, Messianic Jews say, well, hold on. Again, this is part of painful history we have to face, but I've not joined the Inquisition here. And so there's a very significant distinction that we make between the evangelical church that a lot of Israelis see as our best friends in the world to the traditional churches. So 63% significantly identify with the evangelical church, and only 30%, for that very reason, identify significantly with the worldwide church. And the way we worded this in the questionnaire referred to the church that includes all the traditional churches as well. It's something that emotionally we're not quite there. We've also asked the believers in Israel regarding ownership versus rental of the facility they use. Now, this may seem like a small issue, but actually it's not. So a third only a third of the congregations own the facility that they gather, and 2/3 rent it. The reason I say this is significant because I think everywhere, but certainly in the Middle East, certainly in Israel, if you're renting, then first of all, it tells to society you're temporary. You're not really here to stay. And as I said, for the Messianic Jews, because of history, it's something that's quite important. And so often, anyway, okay, we'll just stick with that. Now, another phenomenon that we have, I think that's fairly unique to Israel, is that many times when Messianic Jewish congregations rent a facility, the so-called anti-missionaries find the owner and they convince him, if they have funding, they'll provide funding. If they don't, they'll just convince him to cancel the contract and throw the Messianic Jews out. And so that has happened many, many, many times. So this is why this question of ownership facility is actually quite important. And in the survey, we saw that a lot of the Messianic congregations are seriously praying about purchasing a facility. Some more essentials of the Messianic community. 80% regarding persecution. And when I say persecution, I want to explain what that means. It starts with small things like marginalization. Okay, and because you are a Messianic Jew, in your workplace or wherever in the studies or whatever it is you're doing, people are going to look at you strange. You're not going to be considered one of the guys or one of the girls, and just be marginalized. Not all your civil rights be given to you. You have to demand them sometimes. That's on a softer part. On the harder end of the continuum is, your picture is put in a poster. The poster is hung all over the neighborhood, and all your friends and neighbors are warned not to come close to you because you're a dangerous person, a very negative person, particularly uncomfortable for our children. Even more active than that is, of course, physical persecution. Well known, several years ago, a bomb was delivered to a house of a Messianic pastor, and his son was near death. He's okay and he's alive, but so everything in that range. For us, it's literally part of life. And now, something that's very, very interesting I want to spend a little bit of time on is internet wars, what I call internet wars with the anti-missionaries. Israelis are very, very connected. How many of you have been to Israel here in the crowd? Okay, a lot of you. So you know that what Israelis do all the time is, we're on our smartphones, but we're not really, checking the weather. We usually watch short videos on YouTube, on Facebook, those kind of things. Israelis are very, very heavy, actually the heaviest users in the world, 60% more than the average American, believe it or not. Nothing to be proud of, but the point is that a lot of effort has been put by Israeli Messianic Jews to share the good news of the Messiah through the internet. So listen to this, on average, 22,000 Jewish people in Israel search Google every month with the word Yeshua or Messiah. So a lot of people are searching. And so, if you know a little bit about how it's done with Google and other search engines, you actually can buy certain search words. So basically, we try to beat, and in most cases we have, beaten the anti-missionary organizations so that the first several websites will be ours, not theirs. So that's going on. And we have, as Israeli Messianic Jews, we've put up a lot of material, testimonials, apologetics that have had a tremendous response. In the state of Israel right now, there are a little under 7 million Jewish people, and those kind of evangelistic videos that Only One for Israel produced have been watched, this is Hebrew only, have been watched more than 14 million times. So the response has been overwhelming, mostly positive, sometimes negative. And of course, the so-called anti-missionary organizations, and I say so-called because I want you to understand, they're not our enemies. They are our brothers, and we are praying for them. And we pray we'll see some Apostle Pauls from among them. So anyway, they try to do their own websites with testimonials and with apologetics on their end why Yeshua is not the Messiah. So the anti-missionary organizations actually mail to our homes by name. I mean, they have our name and our address, very unconstitutional, a booklet they called Searching, a magazine for Jews who lost their way. And they have articles about, trying to prove that Yeshua is not the Messiah. So a group of up-and-coming Messianic Jews in Israel, came together and said, well, we want to publish a Contra magazine. So we started publishing a magazine called Finding, a magazine for Jews that are tired from searching, where we answer the issues they raise. Now, humorous as it may seem, the important thing, and this is why I'm telling this, is, this is probably the first time since, the very, very first centuries that local Messianic Jews are publicly going against the authority of the Pharisees, basically. And this is, it is humorous, but it's an internal conversation within our people. Because much of it is apologetics that are very, you have to have a lot of background in Jewish history to understand. But this is quite significant and has not happened for a long, long time. One thing that's, of course, close to our hearts, and actually this has come up, I didn't mention this, but I want to mention this, the whole issue of biblical and theological training. It came up on the 1989 study. At that time, they were close to zero. And most of the leaders, most of the pastors had no theological biblical training whatsoever. In 1989, it was even more so. And again, leaders said, we want it, we don't have it, but we really, really want it. In 2017, and for time's sake, I'm not going to go into it, but of course, that's the heart of what we do at Israel College of the Bible. The situation is a little bit better. And of the 300 congregations, many of them, actually most of them, have at least one person in their leadership that had some biblical theological training. Most of them had some sort of a degree program with us. But the interesting thing is that we asked them, how important is for you? And 84% view biblical theological training as very, very important. And this is not surprising. Whenever there's a movement of God, the enemy of our souls try to imitate. So we have our fair share of challenges in the Israeli Messianic Jewish community. But the interesting thing, and I think the most important thing that came out in this study, is that people under the age of 44, the younger people, we divided younger than 44 and older than 44, the younger than 44 statistically significantly indicated that biblical theological training is very important to them, more to the adult population. So the importance of education is growing, not diminishing in the Israeli Messianic community. The believers in Israel are very committed. 95% attend 3 to 4 meetings a month, weekend meetings a month. So we may say that, well, maybe the sample is skewed and maybe the more committed ones are the ones that answered. It's hard to say. That's always the issue with the sample, but certainly shows that the community is committed. 60% also go to a midweek meeting 3 to 4 times a month. So a very committed community. We've also asked about political inclination. 63% of Messianic Jews in Israel say that their political inclination is right of center. And 16% said it's left of center. The others were not sure. This is not surprising. This is kind of what you find in the general Israeli population. So, and it's that's the trend right now in Israel. So, there's more. And you'd need to fully read the chapter when it comes out if you want. But I'll just say some of the things that we are seeing, what are we expecting to see in the coming decades. And I think there's going to be several things. First of all, I think we're going to see a lot more people, and I mean a lot more people, that come to know the Lord. I think many of the Israeli Messianic Jews that are at the younger generation now are going to go to many, many, many other places in Israeli society. The most important thing is that Israeli Messianic Jews, particularly the younger generation, have no issue with the fact that they're Israelis. They don't feel the need to prove it. That's who they are. That's who we are. So it's a big, big, big thing. And, in that respect, the pioneers before 1948, after 1948, God has blessed it. And that's quite important. I think we're going to see a lot more people in leadership positions in Israeli society. I particularly think we're going to see a lot more people in leadership position in biblical education in Israel. I think that's going to be a huge theme, both not just in our seminary, but I think also in the state universities, because in the general population, the decline in the Hebrew Bible is dramatic. I mean, there's many articles written about it. So I think as Israeli Messianic Jews, that's a huge opportunity, and we're trying to seize that. So for time's sake, and I want to leave a couple of minutes for questions, I want to show you an action picture. Let's see if it's here. One of the highlights of my year. It kind of demonstrates a little bit of what I'm saying about the Israeli Messianic community. I'm there on the right. The four brothers that are there with me declared their faith in the Messiah Yeshua in immersion in the Sea of Galilee. On the left-hand side, there's a good friend that is in his 40s. He comes from an Orthodox Jewish background and came to the Messiah after he started reading the Bible. It's quite unusual, but he thought he was the only one. Most of us think that. But then he went online and he typed something in, and boom, he found our website. So he discovered that his business was literally on the same street where we are. So he comes to visit. It was a wonderful moment. The guy, the second from the left, is a young fitness instructor, and he too thought he was the only one. Googled us or YouTubed us. The guy in the middle is a wonderful and very, very intelligent Arab believer in the Messiah. He comes from a traditional Christian background. It meant nothing to him, but due to a personal something happened in his own life, he went to Hebrew school, so he types in Yeshua. Boom, he comes to our websites. And he's seeing those Jews talking about Yeshua all the time. And he's like, the Jews are coming to Christ now? I mean, So he became a follower of Yeshua. And the fourth guy, a young man, a Jewish man that heard the good news of Yeshua in the military. And he was in the military with a daughter of a well-known pastor, a good friend in Israel. And what he remembers from their first conversation is that she told him, if you don't believe in Yeshua, you're going to hell. She denies it, but that's what he says. But the point is, these are the people that are coming in more and more. So praise God. So let me stop now and see if there are any questions.
Okay, we're going to take a few questions, and so why don't I give you this?
Dr. Soref, I know you're a very humble man because, as you know and I know, one of Israel has been the largest impact of Jews coming to the Messiah in Israel than any other ministry combined. It's incredible what you're doing with technology. Question, Aliyah, is it still difficult for a Jewish person from the United States or anywhere else to make Aliyah in Israel? And number two, replacement theology is still a big issue among Arab believers in Israel, I believe. And I'm just wondering what you're doing with that as well.
Okay, thank you. So the first question was aliyah, meaning immigration. Aliyah literally in Hebrew means to come up. It's actually in the Bible. But you come up to Israel when you immigrate to Israel. And when you're immigrating from Israel to somewhere else, you're going down. It's just kind of the way this works. By the way, it's in the Bible. It's not modern Hebrew that invented it. When Abram went to Egypt, he went down to Egypt. Okay, but to immigrate, to make aliyah to Israel for Messianic Jews that are living outside the land, Israel is a country of immigration, and particularly following the Holocaust, one of our foundational laws is called the law of return. And any Jewish person from anywhere in the world, if he can prove that he's a descendant up to 3 generations of a Jewish person, he can immigrate to Israel, no questions asked, get citizenship, and so on, or get citizenship, no questions asked. But recently, with the increasing number of Messianic Jews, there started to be some questions asked. And it's a long answer, but to answer it very briefly, I will say that it is better for Messianic Jews living outside the land of Israel to come to Israel first and then start the process of immigration. Because if you started from America, for example, and you started online, there's actually a question there. Do you believe in Yeshua? Yes or no? And if you say yes, the answer would be, it seems you're not eligible to immigrate to Israel. End of process. Now, this answer is simplistic. There is a lot more I can say. It is still possible, definitely possible for Messianic Jews to immigrate to Israel. And I'm not saying this to discourage, but I do encourage you to be wise about it and get some counsel. Second question about our Arab brothers and sisters in Israel and regarding their stance regarding replacement theology or supersessionism that was discussed in Dr. Blazing's session. It's actually less than one would think. We have a privilege at One for Israel, as it calls the Bible, we have a privilege to serve many, many of the pastors. And actually, most of them do not hold to supersessionism, at least not tightly. I mean, they're open for conversation. And many of them don't hold to it at all. So, yeah.
I think you might have already answered my question, but I'll run by you after all, and you can tell me to sit down. I noticed you mentioned Arabs at the beginning, and then the picture also. Is there an Arab percentage included in all of the percentages that you gave? Is the question, and is there a guesstimate?
Sit down. No.
Yeah.
All the numbers, thank you, it's a good question. All the numbers I've mentioned only relate to Jewish believers in Yeshua, only to Messianic Jews in Israel. There are numbers, and you have to buy the book because there's a chapter about the Arab believers, but I'm going to steal the thunder. Please.
Last question. Thank you for your time. It's been a huge blessing. Regarding the statistics that you put up there, about 30,000 Jewish believers in Yeshua, obviously there's a lot of believers that have not professed it. I can imagine, I don't know if it's double that number. Well, you probably speak to Jewish people that do not want to do the interview. They don't want to really profess it at this time. How many people, Jewish people, do you believe are out there? I mean, it's a guesstimate, obviously, but with you speaking to different Jewish people, I mean, what would you guesstimate?
Yeah, the question is, how many Jewish believers in Yeshua are there in Israel that are not included in the 30,000, because the 30,000 are in the congregations. So as you said, it's only an estimate, it's a guess, there's no data, it's almost impossible to gather data on this. All I can say is that particularly our media people that are in touch with a lot of people electronically, they feel, but all it is a guesstimate and a feeling. It's not viable that there may be as many Messianic Jews outside the congregations as there are inside. But again, I have no way of verifying this, so big grain of salt with that.
Last question.
Quick question. I'm wondering for Gentiles, because I am a Gentile, unfortunately. Wish I was Jewish. My mom always said, "You're a closet Jew." And I'm like, I know. But so I'm wondering, is it good for, would it be good for Gentiles to go to Israel and evangelize to Jewish people and engage in that in theological education with them? Because one of the things I'm thinking of doing is training up to teach Hebrew and in that theological education. And is that easy to do? Because I'm a Gentile and have no Jewish roots. How can that practically be done? So.
Okay. So the answer, Stephen, right? Jason. Yeah, there we go. But thank you for the question. The question is, What's the role of Gentiles in sharing the good news of the Messiah with Jewish people? Is it a good idea to come to Israel and try to share your faith? And particularly for Jason personally, regarding coming to Israel to be involved in theological education. Did I get it? Yes. Okay. So first of all, I would say up to, say, 15 years ago, most of the Messianic Jews have heard the good news of Yeshua from Gentile believers. So, one of the main tasks of the Gentile church, of the church in general, is to cause the Jewish people to jealousy. So there is a place for it. Now, in Israel, I would say our government does not look favorably upon tourists coming and giving leaflets on the street or those kind of things. It does not look favorably upon it. But if you come as a tourist, Israelis would love to practice their English with you and ask you, well, why do you come to Israel? And then you can tell them, because I love the Jewish Messiah. And believe me, a conversation will ensue. The door is not going to be closed. So that way, certainly. With regards to theological education and so on, the biggest challenge in coming to Israel long term is a status to stay long term. And that is the biggest challenge, not to mention that the theological education is done in Hebrew, but as a visiting professor or so on, it certainly is possible.